Alors, on va être prêt à commencer.
The meeting is about to begin. Please take your seats. Good morning, and welcome to meeting number 62 of the Standing Committee on the Status of Women. Today, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, we will be continuing our study of sexual harassment in the federal workplace. We have a panel with us today from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I'd like to welcome you, Mr. Hubert Lacroix, President and Chief Executive Officer, and Ms. Monique Marcotte, Interim Executive Director for the Human Resources. You have a rather long title. I won't read it all. Here's how we will proceed. You have 10 minutes for your opening remarks, and when you have a minute left, I will point that out to you, and then we'll move on to questions and answers. You now have the floor. Thank you. Madam Chair.
Thank you for allowing Monique and I to appear before you today and to participate in your study on sexual harassment in the federal workplace. Let me start with a quote, if I can. CBC Radio-Canada considers all forms of discrimination, including discriminatory and sexual harassment, to be unacceptable. It will not tolerate its occurrence and will make every reasonable effort to ensure that no employee is subject to it. That commitment actually comes from our corporation's policy on anti-discrimination and harassment, which is posted on our website. You have a copy before you. The
policy defines discrimination and discriminatory harassment and gives examples. It sets out mechanisms for redress, including disciplinary action. It establishes confidentiality provisions and tells employees how to get action on complaints or concerns. Together with our policies on the prevention of workplace violence and our policy on discipline, which you also have before you, our corporation strives to ensure that all employees are treated with dignity and respect. Should this not happen, we deal with it as quickly as possible. CBC Radio-Canada currently has 8,599 employees across Canada, 4,597 men and women over the past 3 years. The corporation has received in all of the 48 cities across Canada and the territories where we have a presence, a total of 3 complaints of sexual harassment. In one case, an employee received a written reprimand. In the second, an employee received a written reprimand and was ordered to take sensitivity training. And in the third case, the employee was suspended for 2 days and also ordered to take sensitivity training. As far as I'm concerned, one complaint is one too many, and we continue to strive to improve our record. In 2007, all employees, as well as their managers across the organization, were required to complete Respect in the Workplace training. This training was a joint program developed and offered by the unions and management. And right now, we are running an online training session against violence in the workplace, which every employee is required to complete, including, as I said before, the President and Chief Executive Officer.
A single outstanding complaint of sexual harassment. I'm proud of our continuing efforts to ensure that people who work at CBC Radio-Canada can thrive in an environment that is free from harassment of any kind. Given our record, you might wonder why you have been seeing stories in Québécois newspapers, The Sun and Journal de Montréal, and also on the television network Sun TV suggesting that CBC Radio-Canada is a hotbed of sexual harassment. Québécois Media based its story on an access for information request which it made and which asked for, and I quote, copies of all documents, including emails, complaints, memos, internal reports, etc., regarding reports of harassment or inappropriate behavior involving CBC employees since January 1, 2010, limited to Toronto and Ottawa. We provided this information. There's a copy right here in front of me. 1,454 pages, mostly emails between human resources staff working to resolve human resources issues. Most of those details are blacked out because they are personal information. That's the law. Québec's Brian Lilly used that as an excuse for speculation and innuendo. Here I quote from a QMI story that ran in le Journal de Montréal on January 31. CBC Radio-Canada a remis une pile de documents faisant état
a pile of documents relating to 1,454 cases processed between January 1st, 2010 and halfway through 2012 in Ottawa and Montreal.
Harassment at the RCMP and linked us also to the recent revelations of sexual abuse at the BBC, the now famous Jimmy Savile story. He insists that he's just doing his job, holding us to account. Well, if that was true, you would think that he might have asked us a single question before he launched his attack. If he had, we could have told him the facts. Of the 2 locations he requested, Toronto and Ottawa, over the time period he requested, since January 1, 2010, we have had 1 complaint of sexual harassment, which we addressed. Sexual harassment in the federal workplace is a serious issue and deserves to be treated as a serious issue. Last fall, David Suzuki, CBC host of The Nature of Things, was invited by Montreal's John Abbott College to speak to students. Another access for information request for all the documents about this visit followed, and then, a few weeks ago, Québécois was at it again. Sun TV's Ezra Levant used the documents to make this outrageous claim that David Suzuki was, and I'm quoting, procuring girls to be his escorts. You have copies of his stories and transcripts of his program in front of you. Once again, untrue. Once again, the Québécois employee didn't check with the college, with David Suzuki, or anyone else who would actually tell him that his allegations were false. After his first story, John Abbott College responded, a copy of which you also have in front of you. I'd like to read one section. There was no rider in Dr. Suzuki's contract specifying the gender or dress code of those assisting him throughout the day. The negative comments and innuendos made are demeaning to those students and to the college. Statement concludes, the college is committed to providing our students with an expansive view of society to assist them on their path to becoming critical thinkers. It is a shame that along the way, they are also witnesses to the falsification of information considered to be acceptable practice by news professionals. Écoutez, je m'attends pas à ce que
Now, listen, I don't expect the Sun's agenda to change, but I believe it is important to call them out when they are deliberately misleading Canadians, when they're taking a serious issue like sexual harassment and turning it into a weapon for their own interests. I'm sure I'm not the first person to feel unfairly treated by a reporter. There are probably some people who have been unhappy with their treatment by CBC Radio-Canada, and maybe even in this room. They're thinking, welcome to my world, Hubert Lacroix. Fair enough, but let me point out a few differences between CBC Radio-Canada and Québécois Media. CBC Radio-Canada has journalistic standards. Our guide, Journalistic Standards and Practices, sets out how our journalists are to do their jobs. In fact, the guide is used as a model for journalistic organizations around the world. And we also have 2 ombudsmen who investigate complaints of unfair coverage, and they issue a public report. Should there be a debate about public broadcasting? Absolutely. There should be a debate about CBC Radio-Canada, about what services we provide, about how we respond to incidents of harassment or violence in the workplace. But to be useful, the debate must be based on something other than attacks, unfounded attacks by a media competitor. I thank you for your time. Yours, is an important study. Monique and I would be pleased to take your questions, Madam Chair. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And we'll now move on to questions, beginning with Ms. Troupe for 7 minutes.
Thank you for being here today, and I'm glad to hear that sexual harassment in the federal workplace is a serious issue, so I appreciate that. So just so I'm understanding, so in your report, I know the people that are attacking you, you indicated that they asked for copies of everything and then you gave them copies of everything, but where are they getting, I guess I wasn't clear on, where are they getting the data that they're accusing you of having so much more than what you're saying you have? Like, where is this data coming from that they're getting, even though, like, what made them ask you to provide those 1,500 pages, for example?
Access to information, as you know, is simply CBC Radio-Canada is subject to access to information. Any kind of request made by a requester is sent to us. We analyze the request, and as you know, the mechanism of the Act say that we have to respond when it's a question of general administration, which this was. We were very proud to provide them with the 1,000 whatever pages, and they decided to write it up in that way. We provided to them those pages.
Right, so you provided the pages, but are they saying that they found information in those pages that would be relevant to sexual harassment?
I'll ask Monique to tell you what exactly was in those pages, because as
I'm just
you
wondering
heard
where they found this information from.
Well,
I mean, because
your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah, the stats are so different. Like, I mean, they're way off compared to what you're saying.
So I've gone through the 1,454 pages in detail, and in there found that, first of all, the request was for incidents of sexual harassment or inappropriate behavior. We interpreted inappropriate behavior to be any disciplinable offense. So within those 1,400 plus pages, there are 62 complaints, of which 23 are informal complaints, 8 were withdrawn, and the remaining 31 were formal complaints.
Right.
Within those 31, there was 1 incident of sexual harassment.
Okay, thank you. So how do you collect your data? How do you get your data?
So each of our human resources bureaus is responsible for ensuring that we keep records, regardless of whether it's a formal complaint related to sexual harassment or another matter. All formal complaints we keep on file. In terms of tracking, we've just started to track in terms of the trends as to what the incidences or what the nature of the complaints are. We also keep informal records for informal complaints, because we do obviously have informal complaints that an employee might bring forward. Those generally we destroy after, if the complaint is either withdrawn or the employees settle the matter between themselves.
Okay. So they have. So they're. I guess I'm just trying to understand. So how is training provided to the women, for example, at CBC? Like, is there an area? Is there a harassment coordinator? Like, how do they? What's the series of events that happen if someone has a complaint?
Once we become aware of a complaint, whether it's anecdotally or third party or even directly, there are a number of ways an employee can access or can advise, either through human resources, and we have bureaus in all of the major centres in Canada. They can also advise through their union, whether a union rep or union member of their executive or their national union office, or they can also advise their manager. If their manager is the subject of the complaint, obviously it wouldn't be appropriate to advise their manager, in which case they would either advise the manager of the manager, or they would come through one of the other venues. Once we become aware, we meet immediately with the employee, and we discuss the nature of the behavior, and we discuss with them what are their options in terms of either an informal complaint, which is generally a type of mediated complaint, or a formal complaint, which begins a formal investigation process.
Okay, thank you. And now you said there was one case of sexual harassment? Is that right?
So within the documents provided
Right.
under the ATIP request, there was one. Since January 1st, 2010, within the organization, we have had 3 complaints of sexual harassment.
So
3
you-
formal complaints.
Formal. So what's the difference between formal and not formal? Like would informal be someone that doesn't want to take it to the next level?
They may, yeah. So we will always discuss with them what their options are. An informal complaint is generally we mediate with the employee. There's not it's not a formal process. A formal complaint kicks in when a written complaint is filed with Human Resources. And then what happens is that we do a triage with senior management in the Human Resources Department as to whether who will conduct the investigation. Human Resources will not conduct investigations for our own client groups. So
Right.
as an example, I support corporate clients. I would not conduct an investigation with my clients because I'm familiar with a lot of the managers and the employees. So we try and ensure that we have an objective party to conduct the investigation. At times, if required, we will bring in third-party investigators. Sometimes it's because of the complexity, the location. In terms of the types of complaints that we manage, they can be from sexual harassment.
1 minute.
To misuse of a corporate card, to lack of respect in the workplace. That's something that we're very focused on, is lack of respect.
Right.
It runs really the gamut of behavior, of human behavior.
But you differentiate between harassment and sexual harassment?
Yes, we do.
Right, okay.
Yes, we
Because
do.
not everybody, like we've had witnesses in the last few months, and not everybody differentiates between it. So they might have X number of harassment complaints, but there may be none or a high level of sexual harassment.
So we have had 8 complaints of harassment within those 3 years that I spoke of earlier, 3 of which were sexual harassment.
Right.
The remainder were more in the area of personal harassment, which actually falls under our prevention of workplace violence policy.
And then just very quickly, is there any type of survey that you take within your employees so that you know
Yes.
if it's harassment or sexual harassment? Is that separated as well?
Yvonne, do you want to? So we've recently conducted 2 surveys, one in 2010, and we did what we call a mini survey or pulse survey in 2012. We didn't have per se specific questions on harassment, but we did have questions on respect in the workplace. In 2010, 54% of the employees responded that they felt that they had experienced respect in the workplace regardless of their title. And in 2012, we did a check-in on that, and the results were much better.
Thank you.
Merci. Désolée.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I have to cut you off when the time is up. And now we'll move on to the opposition side with Ms. Day for 7 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'll be sharing my time with Ms. Matheson. I have a question that goes to the heart of the issue. Your main competitor made a request to its newspapers for ATIP requests. There were over 1,000 pages that were provided. It pointed out that this had to do with inappropriate behavior. Unfortunately, your organization does not agree with the number of cases. Could you please just reconfirm that the total number of cases, and could you confirm that the way the information was reported was biased and that your competitor tried to undermine, in fact, your credibility? Well, you heard from Monique and myself that the ATIP response from Québecor included 1 case throughout the organization, and since 2010, throughout the country, there were 3. Now, people from Québecor media choose to interpret this as they like, as they wish. I actually quoted the Journal de Montréal earlier on, where they said that there were over 1,000 cases that had been dealt with, and that sort of information seems to be exaggerated, and that's why we're trying to set the story straight before you. Any kind of harassment is important, we feel. We pay a lot of attention to it. Monique can tell you herself, well, she actually did in response to the previous question. She can tell you the kinds of initiatives that we've taken. The chief executive officer himself is involved in these workshops and sensitivity training, and speaking to Quebecor's intentions are quite difficult for me. So actually, there's a very small percentage of true cases that you've just confirmed. That's very positive. Can you tell me then what kind of mechanisms you have in your organization? You mentioned training earlier, but within that training, can you tell me what kinds of resources that you have and what exactly happens? Well, first of all, in 2007, all our staff took Respect in the Workplace training, including human resources. And then currently, as Hubert mentioned earlier, all staff have to follow online training on prevention of violence in the workplace. Furthermore, human resources take training as well. Each new employee has to take this, but in 2010, all employees had to take it, and new employees. And that was training into formal investigations. So they had to basically go through the sequence of events that have to unfold once a formal complaint is filed. So your organization has been very active over several years, and it's known for having dealt well with its employees in a conflict situation. So how would you currently describe the workplace in terms of respect amongst employees? Well, we just undertook a survey amongst our employees in November 2012. 86% of our staff responded positively to the comment that CBC Radio-Canada supports diversity in the workplace and acknowledges the value of human differences. So that is a very positive result. And it's also a much higher percentage. It went up by 12 points compared to the 2010 survey. So it was good in 2010, but I think that we've made even more progress, positive progress since. And perhaps I would just add to Monique's response in saying that amongst our priorities at CBC that we've made clear since 2008, individuals are our main priority, and strategic planning. Content is the second, strategic planning is the third. So we've done a lot of work to make our processes and our work more transparent. We've worked with the unions, and as Monique pointed out earlier, there is training on respect in the workplace. So we have various seminars and training, and that's a joint initiative between the unions and the employer in management to make sure that the policies are well explained. And in a complex environment, it's important to be able to build on that. So the news came out under your competitor. Do you think that could increase stress or frustration amongst your staff? Well, when you read that kind of news, that really isn't providing accurate information to Canadians and results in things like us having to come forward and set the story straight. So it's very important for you to understand how important human values are for the CBC. We work hard to protect them and uphold them. And so when people attack CBC in this way, obviously the Chief Executive Officer is going to stand up and say, that's unacceptable, here are the facts, and that's what we're doing today. I'll share my time now with my colleague. Thank you.
Monsieur Lacroix and Madame Marcotte for bringing this information to us, for your quick response to complaints and your very obvious concerns
you have 1
and
minute
need to address sexual harassment. It is a form of violence, and to that end, I would like to bring a motion to this committee that the committee conduct a study of the recommendations of the panel on violence against women in Canada, and that it report to the House on the progress made towards each specific recommendation, including an action plan to complete those recommendations not yet implemented, and that the committee set aside adequate time and resources to hear from witnesses who could assist in the study, and that each caucus submit names to the clerk to ensure the thoroughness of the study. And I have a copy of that motion for our clerk, and I'm providing notice of that motion. Thank you. And if there's any time left at all, I'd like to say that it concerns me very much that in a situation where we're depending on the veracity of the media that there would be false accusations and a deliberate or an apparent skewing of information and data. And I'm wondering your response. Peut-être in writing. Yeah, thank you.
Désolée. Merci.
I'm sorry, I'll have to cut you off. Thank you. And we'll now move on to Ms. O'Neill Gordon. So you have 7 minutes.
Time to be with us here today. This has certainly been a thorough study for our committee, and the more we go through it, we learn that every department works towards having a sexual harassment-free workplace, or just a free harassment place. And it is very important to see that civil servants and all workers go to their day's work facing the regular challenges and not have to worry about all the sexual harassment or any other harassment, because as they do their day's work, they face enough challenges as it is. When you talk about training, one question I had, is this training mandatory? Is it something they get every year? Is it just something they take when they come in the first time, or how does that work?
In terms of, so there are a number of things again. Mandatory training for respect in the workplace, which occurred in 2007, mandatory training for prevention of violence in the workplace, which includes the concept of bullying and ostracizing. So that is mandatory training, and we have an obligation under legislation to review our policy every 3 years, and I believe, although to the best of my knowledge, I believe we have to renew our training on that same cycle. New employees who come in must review all policies, all management policies, including the anti-harassment and discrimination policy, including the violence in the workplace policy. Human Resources has mandatory training as it comes when it comes to the formal investigation process, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay. Now, is this training paid for by is there any training paid for by the individual, or is it all paid by the CBC?
It's all provided by the CBC. The prevention of workplace violence is an online training. So basically the employee logs in, and then we tag who's had it, who hasn't had it. But all that training, all mandatory training, when it's mandatory by the employer, our practice is that we pay for it.
Now, if we talked about sensitivity training, and is this general training different from the sensitivity training, and is it just sensitivity training just taken when they're reprimanded?
The sensitivity training was very targeted training. The case that I'm familiar with, the individual in question was suspended for 2 days, and given the events that brought the complaint, we were very cibled. We were very targeted in the type of training that we provided the respondent in that case. So we try to make sure that whatever training that we provide, it's very specific to the events of the file.
Yes. Okay. What is your policy's definition of sexual harassment? Do you have a definition of that? Or?
So I'll refer to the policy if you...
Of which also you have, I think, a copy.
There's a
in front of
copy.
you.
Yeah, it's very specific. Discrimination, but sexual harassment on page 4 of the policy, at least on my copy, on the bilingual copy, is defined in the Canada Labour Code as any conduct, comment, gesture, or contact of a sexual nature that is likely to cause offense or humiliation to any employee, or that might on reasonable grounds be perceived by that employee as placing a condition of a sexual nature on employment or on any opportunity for training or promotion. And then there are more specific, and we provide examples within the policy that it can include unwelcome advances, flirtations, jokes or propositions of a sexual nature, unwanted requests for sexual favors, sexually degrading words, images, or other material, and conduct of a sexual nature, including leering, pinching, touching, or patting.
Okay. Now, I know you've created this policy. How often do you review the policy on sexual harassment?
So we've had a policy that I can track at least back to 1990. We review regularly our policies on generally a 5-year cycle. This policy was just revised in February of 2010. mostly to reflect the changes to the Canadian Human Rights Act. There were a couple of discriminatory areas that were added, such as family status as an example. So we made sure that our policy reflects the current legislation.
Okay. And how do your employees in your workplace report the harassment? Is there a certain process that they go through?
So our focus is always on making sure that the employee is aware that there are a number of venues that they can access in terms of bringing a complaint forward. They can come directly to Human Resources. They can speak to their manager. They can speak to their union representative. They can speak to another employee. As soon as we become aware in Human Resources that there is a possibility or a potential complaint of this nature, we deal with it immediately. We bring in the employee, we have a confidential conversation, we discuss the nature of the events, and we discuss with them their options as to whether an informal process, what the steps are for an informal process versus a formal process.
Okay. Did you have something to add?
No.
Okay. And what's the average time that it takes for a resolution of an alleged incident of sexual harassment?
So in the cases where we did have the 3 complaints that Yval mentioned earlier, in 2 cases the files were treated within 2 months, and in the 3rd case, 5 months. And the reason that case was a bit longer was that there were a lot of witnesses that were interviewed.
You have 1 minute.
Yes. As we know, as you said earlier, even one case of harassment, sexual or just general harassment, is too many. But we know that being proactive is an important factor in preventing harassment. What are some of the important proactive measures that are being provided to make it happen, that you're proactive and it prevents them from really taking place?
So I'm just going to summarize quickly because I heard the 1 minute bell. Online training, surveys, making sure that we have a conversation going about these issues on a constant basis, and being aware that is, and everybody else in the corporation being aware that this is something that we are interested by and want to focus on. And you can't do anything but do this in an environment where, 50% of our workforce are women, and in my little team, at the most senior executive team level at CBC Radio-Canada, there are 8 people in it. 5 are women, 3 men. So, this is a constant conversation.
Devons vous arrêter ici, Monsieur Lacroix.
Thank you, Mr. Lacroix. And we'll now move on to Mr. Regan for 7 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and welcome to the witnesses. Madam Chair, as you know, I am not a regular member of this committee. I'm here as a substitute today for the Honourable Judy Scrow. So I'm not necessarily completely up to date on everything that you have been discussing. Could you just please let me know if the committee has decided or not to invite a representative from Québecor to come and testify before the committee and to respond to some of those accusations? I think the allegations are quite serious, and as described. I understand your question, Mr. Regan, and it's very nice of you to speak to me in French, by the way. No, Québecor has not been invited. Perhaps that's something that will be discussed within the committee when we discuss future business later on. So thank you for bringing that up. Well, I think that the harassment issue, sexual harassment issue, is a very important and serious one. And the way in which Québecor has been treating this issue, I feel, is very troubling and unacceptable. So I hope that you'll be following up on that. Mr. Lacroix, did you file any kind of or make any kind of complaint to the standards, the broadcasting standards?
You're not a member of that.
Ah. Okay, thank you. Well, that was the obvious question, I thought, but I wasn't aware of that. Because it seems to me that, this really does diminish the issue when they treat it this way. Obviously, the fact that you talked about one sexual harassment case, obviously that's serious. From what you've indicated, you've treated it very seriously. You have policies in place. I'm obviously pleased to hear that. Like anyone else would be, I'm concerned to hear there was one case. whatever numbers, obviously, as you've indicated, is a serious matter. What can you tell me about what proportion of you've got obviously a variety of collective agreements within the CBC, many different employee groups. What can you tell me about what proportion of the collective agreements that you have any specific reference to sexual harassment?
So we have six collective agreements that deal with our employee group. We have other agreements that deal with artists and talent and so on, but we have six that deal with our employees. Of those, the Canadian Media Guild, which is the collective agreement that is our collective agreements are distinguished by geography. So the Canadian Media Guild is the production, journalistic, and editorial union that governs the working conditions for employees outside of the province of Quebec and the city of Moncton. And they have two very interesting articles, one that deals specifically with harassment, and they're obviously their focus on preventing harassment in the workplace. They, however, refer back to the CBC's HR policy on anti-harassment. They also have an article on respect in the workplace, and that was the genesis for the training that Yubel spoke of earlier in 2007. And that very much speaks about the climate of work and how CBC's focus is on ensuring that we have a respectful workplace, and that article is the genesis of that. APS, so that's our Association of Professionals and Supervisors, they have also an article that refers back to our management policies, and the SAFP, or the QP agreement, also has an article, anti-harassment, anti-discrimination article, that again, they always refer back to our policy. So we have three that refer specifically to our policy, and then the other three are silent on the question of harassment per se, but have anti-discrimination articles.
Sujet encore de Québécois et leurs actions.
So coming back to Québécois and what they reported, you indicated that in response to their request under the access to information provisions for documents, emails, etc., dealing with harassment, that you provided 1,454 pages. And after that, in what was reported in a subsequent article, a QMI article from Brian Lilly, it was stated that there were about 1,454 cases. So it's rather difficult to think that this might be a mistake. Do you think it might be a mistake? Listen, I'm not going to try and describe any intentions to Québécois. And I don't want this to become a witch hunt against Québécois. Mr. Reagan, what I do want to do, however, is to highlight the importance that CBC places on harassment. And that is why we reacted so clearly and so strongly today. Because we feel that this is a very important subject that was diminished by that kind of reporting. And the workplace in CBC is not reflected in these articles on for instance, the one on the front page of Journal de Montréal.
Come forward under the collective agreements have been included in your data
1 minute.
on. Pardon? 1 minute. Okay, merci beaucoup.
Yes,
have been included in your data on harassment. Okay.
Yes, they have.
And how many grievances have been filed in the last 5 years in relation to sexual harassment?
I can't speak to the last 5. We've only studied since January. What we have, we had 3 cases, as Yubel mentioned earlier. One of those was filed under a collective agreement, the CMG agreement that I referred to, the Canadian Media Guild agreement earlier. The other 2 were filed under the policy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You have 30 seconds left if you want to use them up. No, thank you. In that case, then we will move on to Ms. James. We're now on our second round of questions, so you have 5 minutes.
Welcome to both of our guests from the CBC. I'm just going to go back to the definition of sexual harassment. Now, you've indicated that it has been defined by the Canadian or Canada Labour Code. And I asked this question in many of the committee meetings because it has to do a lot of times with interpretation or what one person feels is objectable or an offense or humiliation, et cetera. And the actual clause here states that it's likely to cause an offense or humiliation to any employee or that might on reasonable grounds be perceived by that employee. So I'm just wondering, the million-dollar question that I ask is what's offensive or objectionable by one person may not be necessarily by another person. I know as politicians we have pretty thick skin. We have to be, otherwise we wouldn't be here. So I'm just wondering who at the end of the day makes that determination, what would be, and as it states here, on reasonable grounds, what would be, I mean, who is it within the CBC that actually makes that judgment call? And again, is there any leeway by what may be offensive to one person, but vastly the majority of others would not think so?
When we think of harassment, our perspective in human resources is the receptor of the message or the receptor of the action. How are they perceiving that action or that comment? That for me is the test. And then the other test is the test of the reasonable person, which we refer to in the language here. Ultimately, when an investigation is conducted, if there are witnesses, we will test whether they feel that the comment or behavior, and in all these three cases that we've spoken about today, they're all related to inappropriate comments. So the breaches of behavior are not more serious. They don't go into the gamut of touching or thankfully more serious breaches of behavior. So in all three cases we're talking about inappropriate comments. When we do the investigation, if there are witnesses, we will test whether they felt that on reasonable grounds those inappropriate comments crossed a line. And then ultimately the investigator, who we hope is an objective investigator, will make a recommendation or a finding as to whether a line was crossed. And in all three cases, there was a determination that a line was crossed, and discipline was taken in all three cases.
You mentioned that it was the perception of the person that was receiving the comment. Would that warrant a written, you've stated in your three complaints that you've logged, one was a written reprimand, one was written reprimand plus sensitivity training, the other was suspension of 2 days plus sensitivity training as well. Now, would one warrant one over the other? For example, you've said that they were all, comments that were made. I just want to try and understand what was the difference between those comments where one only received something written on paper that you've stepped over the line or you crossed the line, please check for future reference, and one required training and one actually they were suspended. So what was the difference between those comments?
So the difference between, let's start with the most serious case, which is the case where we had suspension. In that particular case, there had been an incident earlier. So how our documentation works is that we keep all files for a period of 2 years. If the file is clean for 2 years, then we expunge the documents from the file. That's our policy. That's in our collective agreements. In that case, there had been a situation where there had been another incident that had occurred within that 2-year window. So this was, again, a recurrence that had occurred. So it was a more serious measures that were taken. In the other two cases, and I don't have the final investigation report, so I will say this, but my belief is that the comments were more serious in the situation where sensitivity training was imposed than in the other case.
Okay. Thank you. I was reviewing the policies that you handed out, and I appreciate that you did give them to us, so it limits our questions to things we don't find in it.
Right.
One of the things I did not find anything related to has to do with relations or fraternization within the CBC, within departments, employees, and so forth. Is there anything that I've missed in here? Like, did I miss it when I was reading it? Do you have any internal policy, whether it's written down or just a verbal policy on that type of a particular situation?
We do not have a formal written policy on fraternization between employees. What we do have is that when we become aware of a situation, particularly if it's a manager and an employee within a same unit, we have conversations with each of those employees, and we ensure that the reporting lines are distinct, so that, as an example, if we have a manager who has a relationship with, a journalist, as an example, we would ensure that the reporting lines would be changed. If they have a reporting line, we would change the reporting lines to ensure that there's no...
Very quickly, sorry. J'ai dépassé mon temps alors que j'avais dans...
I'm sorry, I forgot that we were down to 5 minutes. I'll just let you wrap up.
Questions. I'll ask the last one. With regards to Ms. O'Neill-Gordon, she was asking about employees and how they're aware of the situation. You said there's online surveys and that you make them aware that you're interested in this issue. But how do you make them aware? Is there a campaign? Is there advertising? What is it that you do on a regular basis so your employees know and can identify sexual harassment and that they're aware of the procedures that they need to follow to report it?
We don't have a formal anti-harassment campaign per se. Our focus in the last few years has really been on respect in the workplace, of which sexual harassment is a key piece. So in terms of any complaint, whether it's sexual harassment or bullying or ostracizing or any of that gamut of behavior, we ensure that all our employees are trained in respect in the workplace, and all our employees have access to information online as to what the process is to file a complaint.
Merci. Donc,
Thank you. I'm sorry, it was my mistake. I gave 2 minutes more to Ms. James, so I'll also give 2 minutes more to the opposition side. And we will move on with Isabelle Morin. And you have 6 minutes. Thank you. I'm also new to this committee. I'll be replacing my colleague who is pregnant, so she is going home for the month to come at least. So I've tried to bring myself up to date on the study that this committee has been spending its time in, and I think that your testimony has been very interesting. I find you're really doing a lot of work to make sure that there is no harassment in the workplace. Now, in your opening remarks, you emphasized that there were official complaints and informal complaints, and that there were only 3 official ones in the past few years. I'd like to know if there have been any informal complaints. Now, you also said that amongst those complaints, I believe there were 7 that were abandoned. Well, can you tell me why? Could you just expand on that, please? Well, in terms of sexual harassment, we see this as a very serious issue. And so even if an employee decides not to come forward with a formal complaint, we have still the possibility of undertaking a formal investigation. In all cases where there has been a sexual harassment complaint, we have decided to undertake a formal investigation. So in all those cases where there were informal discussions, there were no actual cases of sexual harassment in those. It might have been an issue, for example, of a lack of something disrespectful or a change in tone, a disrespectful tone. Often these informal ones have to do with interpersonal conflicts. And so we try to the greatest extent possible to provide for mediation between the parties or the employees. And I would add that in the Respect in the Workplace training or seminars, a lot of attention is paid to the use of words or types of words that are used. So, for example, even if there's a deadline, even if there's a lot of pressure, a lot of stress to get something out on the airwaves, the way you speak is important. And when you're not necessarily good at communicating, you may end up finding yourself in one of these informal complaints. And that's brought to human resources. Thank you very much. You mentioned that you have good online training. I was a teacher myself, and so I'm very familiar with online training. I know that's not necessarily always a good fit with everyone. So some online training is good for people, and some are good in focusing and using online training. What I'd like to know is if you plan on using other kinds of training, other mechanisms, and I'd like to know if you've had any evaluations done of that training by individuals, and if so, did the individuals tell you that they felt this was appropriate, a good training? And I'd like to know if online training is only a part of the training or if there's ongoing training that's a part of. Do you continue with that online training, or is it just a one-time training? Well, there were many elements included in your question, so I will allow Monique to answer, but I'd just like tell you that we're over 8,000 employees working in 48 different cities. And so in order to be able to have access to training, be able to deliver training, online training often is the most appropriate. There are web seminars or question and answer types or surveys. So it truly is a very useful tool for us to use and that we will continue to use in order to be able to make that training immediately accessible to all our employees. And as Monique stated earlier, we are able to follow who has taken that training. And so we can send out reminders to individuals if they have not taken that training in the timelines that were set out. So online training, we feel, is a very good tool to use. Well, what if someone doesn't take the training? You send them a reminder, but then what? Yes, so we'll remind them. There's a way of registering. So the employee registers, and once the individual has completed the training, they have to get right to the end of the training. So once they've completed that training, then they're registered as having been completed. Then they have the option of evaluating the training, and that means that we get that constant feedback. Then the manager on a quarterly basis, more or less, checks in to make sure who has followed it and who hasn't. And in the comments that you got in the feedback forms, what did you read? Well, we've just started the Prevention of Violence in the Workplace online training, so we haven't necessarily gotten to the end of that quarter yet. But there is training. We don't have training specifically for harassment prevention in the workplace. When we're talking about prevention of violence, rather, there is online violence prevention training. And then there are other kinds of training, in-person training. And right now we're actually discussing the launch of other kinds of training. And in terms of your partnerships with unions, how is that going? Oh, it's going very well. This has all been a joint initiative. The suggestions actually came from the union. So we thought it was a very good suggestion, and we actively participated in the organization of these web seminars and the training, and it truly is working very well. We're actually very proud of the seminars that we have organized, and as Monique stated, we're moving into phase 2 so that we can expand on that. Thank you. We'll now move back to the government side with Ms. Ambler for 5 minutes.
And thank you to the CBC for appearing today. My question is about your policy, and we've heard that it dates back to 1990, and you have 5-year reviews. Is that correct?
So our current policy was revised in February of 2010.
2010.
We have had policies since that we can trace back to 1990, so maybe before, but they are reviewed regularly.
Okay. And I wanted to clarify that in terms of keeping records about the cases themselves, that's only been happening since 2010.
No, we have records since prior to then. What we decided was to do a study based on the last 3 years. Okay. Given the interest on the files.
Okay, fair
so
enough.
we do have, again, if an employee has had a clean slate, so to speak, for 2 years, we will destroy the files.
Okay, right. I understand. Thank you. In terms of the CBC specifically and the culture at the CBC, I think I understand that the nature of your business, media, is somewhat like ours. We, as parliamentarians, the situation in which we work can sometimes, we've got long hours. We work closely together. We can often be. We tend to feel like family sometimes. We're close as family, but we also argue like family. And I think the media, I would imagine, is somewhat similar. Lots of late nights, lots of intensity in the work that's done. I'm wondering if that means sometimes that there's a little more leeway in relationships. I use that word relationship loosely. So I guess what I'm asking is, sometimes is there a fine line between interpersonal conflict and harassment? It's a bit of a follow-up from the questions that my colleague, Ms. James, was asking earlier. But do you think that that might somehow contribute to the culture of potential harassment, the culture that might lead to more potential harassment?
I think that we all work in stressful environments. To yours, let's say, because you compare those our lives to the lives of MPs. We also have deadlines. You have deadlines. We have on air. We don't want to go black. That would be a bad thing. We'd like the National to start on time. We'd like Peter Mansbridge, when he smiles to the camera and introduces a piece, to actually have that piece ready. And to be the piece that he's referring to. So all of these things make it has to happen on time. And that was one of the concerns that we had when the Guild came up with the idea of the respect in the workplace conversations, because we found that sometimes the words that were being used, we argued more than family than anything else. We had conversations and maybe some words in a newsroom or between different people that were not appropriate. And that's what we really targeted, and we think that by having this aired out in a seminar kind of context with mediators that are mediators from CBC Radio-Canada, they're not third parties. We have conversations about ourselves, and we deal with them.
Thank you for mentioning that, that the fact that that your mediators come from within the CBC. So I think what you're trying to tell us today overall is that you're dealing with the problem of sexual harassment or harassment of any kind. You're dealing with that in-house. You've got the expertise to do it. You can do it. You're doing it well. You're training. You've got a certain number of cases that you've dealt with. You've dealt with them in an expedient way. And we've heard from a number of other witnesses in this study, and the RCMP is obviously the most well-known example of or a federal organization that we're studying, and they're doing the same thing. Would you say that it's possible for organizations like the CBC and the RCMP to deal with these problems in-house in an effective way, one that's fair to all of the employees?
I want to clarify what Yubel just said. He was speaking about the facilitation of the sessions. So the Respect in the Workplace sessions are jointly facilitated by management and the unions. When it comes to an investigation,
extrapolating. Yes.
Okay. So an investigation may or may not be conducted in-house. We always make sure that whoever's doing the investigation has the appropriate skill set required. When it comes to mediation of informal complaints, that can happen either within a group, with employees. We can bring in facilitators from HR to help with the conversation, or the union.
If you have to bring someone in from
Madame
outside,
Membler,
where would you get them from?
Vous avez écoulé votre temps.
Okay.
Je suis désolée.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, your time is up. And as I said at another meeting, that's why I give you a warning when you have 1 minute left. Well, that wraps up the first part of our meeting on CBC. It went by very quickly, and it was very interesting. So I'd like to thank you both for having accepted to come before the committee and to share your policies on harassment in the workplace with us. Now, in terms of Mr. Regan's request, we found the article. We will send it to the committee members, and then we'll decide what we do, without necessarily undertaking a witch hunt, of course. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to committee business, which is on the orders of the day.
Oui. Ils sont déjà ici. Rectification, les articles.
I'm sorry, I want to make a correction. We already had the articles in our package that was provided.
Yes, for Sun is inside your. Je vais suspendre la séance.
I'm just going to suspend the meeting for 1 minute to give members an opportunity to get something to eat. Committee business is down as public here. Just wanted to let you know.
Ça va, Excusez-moi, je sais pas. Vous voulez aller,
Excuse me, are you saying you would like to move in camera?
Donc, Madame Troupé demande à...
Ms. Troopy moves that the committee go in camera. Anyone opposed? Yes? Yes, Ms. Day. We are opposed to that. This was a request made publicly. You're talking about the motion? In that case, would you like to vote? I believe so.
Whether or not we're going in camera? Is that what we're voting on? Okay.
Ouais. Ouais.
Yes. So shall we move to a vote? Yes? All those in favor of going in camera, please raise your hand. And all those opposed? Thank you. In that case, I will suspend a couple of minutes in order to move in camera.